Look into the abyss of our planet's history, and you will not find a peaceful cradle of life. You will find an endless, ruthless theater of war. When we imagine the deep past, we are comforted by the illusion of distance. We tell ourselves that the monsters buried in stone are safely confined to antiquity. But what if one of those monsters was so perfectly engineered for destruction, so absolute in its brutality, that its sheer existence forces us to question everything we thought we knew about evolution? Forget the apex predators you know. Forget the great white sharks, the killer whales, the prehistoric crocodiles. 380 million years ago, the oceans were ruled by something entirely different. A creature that did not need teeth to tear its prey apart. A beast that wore the ocean floor like a graveyard. This is the story of the Dunkleosteus, the Devonian guillotine, the most terrifying apex predator that ever lived. To understand the magnitude of this nightmare, we must journey back to a time long before the first dinosaur took a breath. We must descend into the Devonian period. Paleontologists often call this era the Age of Fishes, but this title is dangerously deceiving. It was not an age of peaceful aquatic prosperity. It was an era of an unforgiving biological arms race. The waters of our world were a chaotic testing ground for nature's most violent designs. In these prehistoric oceans, survival meant possessing an impenetrable defense. The prey of this era did not rely on speed or camouflage. They relied on heavy, dense, biological armor. Evolution had coated the marine life in solid bone. To survive in the Devonian, you had to become a swimming fortress. And because the prey became fortresses, nature was forced to invent a siege weapon to break them open. Evolution did not strive for balance here. It strove for absolute, devastating supremacy. The result of this brutal equation was the Dunkleosteus. Imagine a creature measuring up to 28 feet in length. Imagine 3,000 pounds of pure, hostile biology. But its massive size was merely the shadow of its true terror. The horror of the Dunkleosteus lay in its architecture. Most of its body was muscular and sleek, designed for sudden, explosive bursts of ambush speed. But its head and thorax were an entirely different nightmare. The front of this animal was encased in plates of solid bone, up to 2 inches thick. It wore a literal suit of armor, fused directly to its skeleton. But the most disturbing anomaly, the paradox that still haunts paleontologists today, rests in its mouth. The Dunkleosteus had no teeth. None. Instead, the bones of its skull extended outward, sharpening into massive, self-honing blades. Every single time this creature opened and closed its mouth, these bone plates ground against each other. It was an endless, automated sharpening process. It did not bite. It executed. The mechanics of this biological guillotine completely defy natural logic. The creature possessed a 4-bar linkage mechanism in its skull. This mechanical advantage allowed the Dunkleosteus to throw its heavy, armored jaw open in exactly 1/5 of a second, 20 milliseconds. In the dense medium of water, opening a massive cavity that quickly creates a catastrophic vacuum. The prey was not just bitten. It was violently inhaled, dragged by an inescapable suction directly into the waiting blades. And when those jaws slammed shut, they delivered a force of over 80,000 pounds per square inch at the tip of the fangs. This is a level of pressure capable of shearing through solid metal. It was a force designed to crush the armor of other Devonian beasts as if they were brittle glass. The Dunkleosteus did not simply chew its food. It fractured, shattered, and utterly obliterated anything caught in its grip. Think about the agonizing reality of existing in those waters. The Devonian Ocean was a realm of perpetual twilight, choked with toxic algae blooms and shadowed by massive, drifting continents. In this abyssal darkness, the Dunkleosteus patrolled like a phantom dreadnought. It did not hunt with the frantic energy of a modern shark. It hunted with the calculated, cold patience of a machine. Its heavy, armored head made it a cumbersome swimmer over long distances, which meant it was an ambush predator. It lurked in the shadows of the ancient reefs, waiting. It watched the heavy, armored prey drift by, completely unaware of the doom waiting in the dark. The sensory experience of the victim would have been brief and apocalyptic. There would be no warning, no sudden rush of water, just the violent, instantaneous opening of a cavernous mouth, the terrifying pull of the vacuum, and then absolute darkness. We must understand that this level of over-engineering is exceptionally rare in nature. Evolution is typically a strict accountant. It balances the energy spent against the energy gained. To grow an armor-plated skull 2 inches thick, to develop the dense musculature required to snap that skull shut in 20 milliseconds. The caloric cost of maintaining this biological weaponry was astronomical. This means the Dunkleosteus was constantly starving. It was a prisoner of its own supremacy. It had to kill and kill and kill just to sustain the heavy machinery of its own body. This was not a creature living in harmony with its environment. It was an apex consumer, driven by a relentless, burning biological furnace. When paleontologists first unearthed these armored skulls from the dark shale of the Earth, they were baffled. They were looking at a creature that broke the rules of evolutionary biology. The fossil record is filled with predators, but it is rare to find an animal that is essentially a living industrial accident. The Dunkleosteus forces us to confront a terrifying reality about our planet. The history of life on Earth is not a steady, upward climb toward complexity and peace. It is a perpetual cycle of biological warfare, punctuated by the creation of nightmares so extreme, they eventually consume everything around them. The sheer physical weight of the Dunkleosteus presents us with a profound biological paradox. To wear a suit of solid bone armor, up to 2 inches thick, is an incredible evolutionary burden. Bone is exceptionally dense. In the aquatic environment, excess density is a death sentence, dragging a creature relentlessly toward the suffocating darkness of the ocean floor. Most modern predators, like the great white shark, rely on cartilaginous skeletons and oil-filled livers to maintain perfect, effortless buoyancy. But the Dunkleosteus defied this logic. It lacked a sophisticated swim bladder. Its skeletal structure was heavily ossified. This means it was essentially a sinking stone wrapped in muscle. It had to constantly expend massive amounts of kinetic energy just to keep itself suspended in the water column. If it stopped swimming, it sank. This leads us to a terrifying question. If this prehistoric titan was so incredibly heavy, so burdened by its own anatomical defenses, how did it possibly catch anything? How did a slow, sinking fortress hunt in a three-dimensional battlefield where its prey was lighter, highly maneuverable, and equally armored? The answer reveals a predatory adaptation that is deeply unsettling. The Dunkleosteus did not chase its prey. It orchestrated an execution in the dark. In the murky, blood-stained twilight of the Devonian seas, vision was a severely limited asset. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense, algae-rich waters. The Dunkleosteus did possess eyes, surrounded by unique rings of bone called sclerotic rings, which protected its vision from the crushing pressures of the deep and the violent impacts of its own hunting methods. But sight was not its primary weapon. It hunted by feeling the fear of its environment. Like modern sharks, this armored leviathan possessed a highly sophisticated lateral line system. This was a network of microscopic sensory pores running along its massive flanks, directly wired into its central nervous system. This allowed the Dunkleosteus to detect the most minute changes in water pressure and electromagnetic currents. It could feel the frantic tailbeats of a wounded placoderm miles away in the absolute blackness. It could sense the electrical impulses generated by a hiding creature's heartbeat. It navigated the abyssal trenches not as a visual predator, but as a biological radar system, perfectly tuned to the frequency of distress. It would locate its target, calculate the trajectory in the dark, and position its massive frame directly in the prey's path. Then it would simply wait, hovering silently like a submerged landmine. But the true horror of the Dunkleosteus is not just how it caught its prey. The most disturbing mystery lies in what happened after the jaws snapped shut. And to uncover this, we must examine the forensic evidence left behind in the fossil record. When paleontologists excavate the ancient feeding grounds of this titan, they do not find neatly digested, pristine skeletons of its victims. They find something far more brutal. They find scattered, compacted masses of shattered, splintered bone, known to science as boluses. You see, the biological guillotine of the Dunkleosteus was so ruthlessly efficient at taking massive, indiscriminate bites out of heavily armored prey that the creature swallowed enormous chunks of indigestible, solid bone. Its stomach was a churning cauldron of highly concentrated gastric acids designed to melt away muscle, fat, and sinew in a matter of hours. But even this prehistoric superacid could not dissolve the thick, heavy armor plates of the other Devonian monsters it consumed. The Dunkleosteus had a gruesome digestive cycle. After the flesh was stripped away in its acidic gut, the heavy, sharp fragments of bone would begin to accumulate, threatening to tear its internal organs apart from the inside. To survive its own meals, the Titan was forced to violently regurgitate the shattered remains of its victims. It would heave out massive, compacted spheres of broken armor and jagged teeth, letting them sink to the ocean floor like biological shrapnel. The fossilized boluses we find today are literal spheres of prehistoric agony, preserving the exact moment of some lesser creature's absolute destruction. Nature rarely engineers a creature this flawlessly lethal without a cost. If you are fascinated by the brutal reality of the Devonian period and the terrifying mechanics of prehistoric survival, comment the word carnage down below, so we know you are investigating this dark history with us. This cycle of brutal consumption leads us to an even darker biological mystery, when you are the apex predator of the entire planet, when your jaws can shatter any armor, when your hunger is a relentless, burning furnace that demands constant fuel. What happens when the prey begins to run out? What happens when a creature engineered for total war can no longer find enemies to destroy? Paleontologists began to notice something entirely chilling on the fossilized armor plates of the Dunkleosteus itself. Deep, parallel gouges. Unhealed, catastrophic fracture lines. Puncture wounds that perfectly matched the precise geometric shape of the Dunkleosteus's own self-honing fangs. This was not a creature that hunted in peaceful packs. When the oceans grew scarce, or when territorial disputes erupted in the blood-rich waters of the Devonian reefs, the ultimate predator turned its apocalyptic weaponry upon itself. They cannibalized each other. The only thing capable of killing a Dunkleosteus was another Dunkleosteus. We are looking at a species so aggressive, so utterly dominant, that its existence became a self-consuming paradox. To comprehend the sheer brutality of a clash between two adult Dunkleosteus, we must abandon our modern understanding of animal territorial disputes. When wolves or lions fight for dominance, there is a complex language of posturing, vocalization, and eventual submission. The Devonian period possessed no such mercy. When two biological dreadnoughts, each weighing over 3,000 pounds and armed with self-sharpening bone guillotines, decided to engage, it was not a display of dominance. It was a cataclysmic collision of armor and kinetic energy. The acoustic shockwave of their jaws snapping shut on each other would have reverberated through the murky water like the detonation of a submerged explosive. Paleopathology, the study of ancient diseases and injuries, reveals a chilling narrative etched permanently into their fossilized skulls. We have unearthed Dunkleosteus plates bearing catastrophic puncture wounds and massive shear fractures. But the most disturbing detail is not the presence of the wounds. It is the undeniable evidence of healing. Many of these titans survived having their facial armor cracked open by their own kind. They survived the deep, agonizing gouges that exposed their internal biology to the toxic, bacteria-rich waters of the prehistoric ocean. This indicates a creature possessing an immune system as relentlessly stubborn as its physical armor. To live as a Dunkleosteus was to endure a life of perpetual, agonizing warfare. They dragged their broken, healing bodies through the dark, driven entirely by an unspeakable imperative to consume and survive. This horrific cycle of cannibalism and territorial violence brings us to a profound and baffling biological paradox. If the adult Dunkleosteus were violently solitary, fiercely territorial, and perfectly willing to execute and devour their own kind, how did the species reproduce without driving itself to immediate extinction? How did two hyper-aggressive, heavily armored killing machines ever get close enough to create the next generation? The answer to this question forces us to look at the very origins of vertebrate reproduction. The placoderms, the armored fish of the Devonian, hold a dark and magnificent secret in their fossilized anatomy. They were the absolute pioneers of internal fertilization. Before the placoderms, marine reproduction was a passive, distant affair, with creatures releasing genetic material into the water currents. But the armored fortresses of the Devonian could not rely on the currents. They developed complex, calcified reproductive appendages. This meant that the act of reproduction for the Dunkleosteus required physical connection. It required two monolithic, cannibalistic predators to temporarily suppress millions of years of predatory instinct, disengage their biological guillotines, and engage in an intimate physical embrace in the absolute darkness of the ocean. It was a terrifying, high-stakes evolutionary gamble. The slightest miscalculation, a sudden shift in the water pressure, or a momentary flare of hunting aggression would instantly turn the act of mating into a fatal execution. The very first moments of physical, reproductive intimacy in the history of vertebrate life were forged in a crucible of extreme danger and potential death. If you are captivated by these dark truths of our planet's ancient history, and if you wish to continue exploring the terrifying realities of prehistoric survival, ensure you subscribe to our channel. We are unearthing the mysteries the Earth tried to bury. Once the perilous act of reproduction was complete, a new, tragic chapter of the Dunkleosteus life cycle began. The fossil record indicates that this apex predator offered absolutely no parental care. The moment the juveniles were brought into the world, they were entirely abandoned in a hostile, unforgiving ecosystem. But the juveniles faced a threat far greater than the toxic environment or the other bizarre predators of the reef. Their greatest threat was their own parents. Because the adult Dunkleosteus were indiscriminate, cannibalistic engines of consumption, they would gladly devour a juvenile of their own species if it crossed their path. To survive, the young were forced into exile. While the massive adults dominated the deep, open waters and the dark pelagic zones, the juveniles had to hide in the shallow, treacherous coastal margins. They lived in constant, nervous motion, their armor still thin and brittle, hunting tiny invertebrates and avoiding the shadows of the deep. It was only after years of survival, once their skeletal plating had thickened and their jaw mechanics had reached critical, lethal mass, that they could finally descend into the abyss and claim their terrifying birthright. They were the undisputed lords of the Devonian oceans, a dynasty of armored titans that ruled through absolute physical supremacy. They had conquered the waters, out-engineered their prey, and established a reign of terror that lasted for 50 million years. But evolution is a cruel, unforgiving architect. By engineering a creature so massively specialized, so incredibly heavy, and so reliant on an endless supply of heavily armored prey, Nature had inadvertently set a trap. The Dunkla Osteus was perfectly designed to conquer the world as it existed, but it was completely unprepared for what would happen when the world itself decided to change. Deep beneath the ocean floor, and high in the primitive alien forests forming on the continents above, a catastrophic environmental shift was beginning to unfold. The very chemistry of the planet was altering, and the armored Titan, in all its invulnerable glory, was about to face the one enemy its biological guillotine could not slice through. The reign of the Dunkla Osteus did not end in a glorious final battle against a rival Leviathan. It ended in a slow, suffocating whisper. 358 million years ago, a catastrophic sequence of events known as the Late Devonian Extinction began to rewrite the fundamental rules of survival on planet Earth. This was not a sudden, violent strike from a meteor. It was an apocalyptic environmental strangulation. And it was an execution perfectly designed to dismantle the ultimate apex predator. To understand the fall of the armored Titan, we must look to the land. For millions of years, the continents had been barren rock, but during the late Devonian, the very first extensive forests began to take root. These massive root systems aggressively fractured the terrestrial rock, breaking down the soil and releasing unfathomable amounts of raw nutrients into the rivers. These rivers bled directly into the ocean. In the delicate chemistry of the marine ecosystem, this massive influx of nutrients triggered a fatal chain reaction. It caused global, catastrophic algae blooms. As these microscopic plants multiplied by the trillions, they covered the surface of the sea, blocking out the sun. And when those algae died and sank to the bottom, the bacteria consuming them drained the ocean of its most precious resource. They consumed the oxygen. The oceans were literally suffocating. Massive expanses of the ancient sea became anoxic dead zones. Toxic, stagnant waters where absolutely nothing could breathe. For the lesser creatures of the sea, this was a mass execution. 75% of all marine species were eradicated. The heavily armored placoderms, the primary food source of the Dunkla Osteus, began to die out in staggering numbers. Their armored fortresses could protect them from the jaws of a predator, but they could not protect them from a suffocating atmosphere. And here, in this collapsing world, the magnificent over-engineering of the Dunkla Osteus became its death sentence. Remember the biological cost of absolute supremacy. The Dunkla Osteus was encased in solid bone. It was profoundly, unforgivingly heavy. To keep itself from sinking into the toxic dead zones at the bottom of the sea, it had to constantly swim. To constantly swim, moving 3,000 pounds of armored muscle, it required a monumental intake of calories. It was a biological furnace that demanded constant fuel, but suddenly the fuel was gone. The oceans were empty. Imagine the unimaginable terror of this apex predator in its final days. A creature engineered to obliterate anything it encountered, now wandering through an empty, silent graveyard. Its hypersensitive lateral lines, designed to feel the vibrations of millions of prey animals, felt only the dead, still water. The mechanical guillotine of its jaw, capable of generating 80,000 pounds of pressure, snapped shut on nothing but shadows. Starvation for a creature of this magnitude is not a gentle fading away. It is a violent, internal collapse. As its muscle mass began to waste away from a lack of food, it lost the kinetic strength required to fight its own extreme density. The armor that had made it invincible, the 2-inch thick plating that had protected it from every threat in the ancient world, now became a crushing, inescapable anchor. It could no longer swim. It could no longer breathe. The greatest biological weapon ever forged by evolution was dragged into the black mud by the weight of its own supremacy. When the Devonian period finally closed, the entire lineage of the placoderms was erased from the earth. Not a single armored fish survived the transition. The brutal arms race of heavy bone was entirely abandoned by nature. Instead, the oceans were inherited by the outcasts. Small, fragile creatures with skeletons made of cartilage instead of heavy bone. Creatures that required very little food and could survive in environments with lower oxygen. These fragile scavengers were the ancient ancestors of the modern shark. They survived not because they were the strongest, but because they were adaptable. The fossilized skulls of the Dunkleosteus sitting in our museums are not just monuments to a terrifying monster. They are a dark, philosophical warning permanently carved into the stone of our planet. They prove that evolution is utterly ruthless. Nature does not reward invincibility. It punishes overspecialization with extinction. We look at our modern world and we believe our dominance is permanent. We believe our technology and our architecture make us untouchable, just as the Dunkleosteus believed its armor made it a god of the deep. But the Earth has a long memory. It has manufactured gods before, and it has buried them all the same. In the vast, uncaring timeline of the cosmos, absolute power is nothing but a temporary, fatal illusion. If you want to delve deeper into the forgotten monsters that ruled this planet, check the link in the description to secure your copy of our exclusive ebook about extinct megafauna. This is a comprehensive guide to the dark biology of the creatures the Earth tried to erase. Producing these massive, investigative documentaries requires an immense amount of scientific research and dedication. To ensure we can continue unearthing these dark truths without relying on corporate sponsors, consider supporting our mission directly on Patreon or buy us a coffee through the links below. Your support is the only thing keeping the true history of our world alive. Until our next investigation, respect the Abyss, because the Abyss remembers everything.